This committee will come to order. This morning, we're going to discuss the need to bring more flexibility and efficiency and effectiveness to our U.S. International Food Aid Program. And let me mention at the outset that there's a problem at the tarmac at Reagan Airport. So we're going to see Mr. Engel in a while, but he's en route. So let me make the observation that a number of the members of this committee had an opportunity to travel with me to Tacloban after the horrible typhoon hit that island and see what the situation was like on the ground. And had it not been for the ability to work around our food aid program and get food there directly, had the food been shipped from the United States, it would have taken 6 months. Fortunately, food was pre-positioned in advance of the hurricane season, so it took 6 weeks. But had USAID not found a way to work around the restrictions and get the local purchases and get the voucher program in place and start feeding people that week, you would have had an absolute crisis on Tacloban. I and other members of our committee saw that. So over the last 60 years, the U.S. government, in partnership with American farmers, as we know the history, and in partnership with shippers and NGOs, has helped relieve the suffering of billions of starving people worldwide. But that proud legacy shouldn't blind us to needed reforms here today. Desperately needed reforms, as we will hear today. Our food aid is needlessly expensive, it takes too long to arrive, and it often does long-term damage to local economies. And so those are the issues we're going to be discussing. Despite the fact that obtaining food closer to an area in crisis or providing vouchers can save time and money and lives, current law requires that our food aid be purchased in and shipped from the United States 6 months away. And that 6 months to get the food there, that's part of the problem. We are the only country that continues this approach to food aid. These requirements have real-life consequences. And as Andrew Natsios, a former administrator of USAID, told this committee, I watched people die waiting for food aid to arrive. So again, it took 4 weeks when we pre-positioned for U.S. food to arrive in the Philippines following the typhoon. It took 6 weeks to arrive in Nepal following the 2015 earthquake. And our food aid program simply wasn't able to provide food when and where it was needed the most. Not only do U.S. purchase and shipping requirements slow us down and add unnecessary transportation costs, by the way, they can also distort local markets, and that's the other thing we need to look at. In 2008, Americans saw truckloads of U.S. food being delivered to northern Kenya, where famine threatened to kill millions. What we didn't see, but now we understand, is that these truckloads of U.S. food depressed local prices and pushed farmers in other parts of Kenya who had an abundance harvest, but we had not transferred from where that harvest occurred to where the famine was occurred. That was not the way we addressed the issue. So instead, it pushed those farmers into deeper poverty, into bankruptcy. Local purchases of food would have avoided this devastating consequence, but that was not an option at the time under the rules. And this scenario has played out again and again from Afghanistan to Haiti. The challenges of food aid have changed since the program was first established in the 1950s. More and more in areas of conflict, food is being used as a weapon against the population. Groups like ISIS and Al-Shabaab are manipulating food aid. Convoys are being attacked. Some countries hosting large numbers of refugees have seen food aid destabilize their economies, and that makes the refugees unwelcome in their minds. Here again, the use of more flexible food aid tools could work, but we need a little flexibility in the equation, and that's what we're trying to engineer here. Current law has not kept pace with today's world. Our government no longer holds surplus food stocks. Agricultural prices are stable. U.S. agricultural exports are at an all-time high, and demand is expected to increase. U.S. ports are doing quite well. Using food aid as a means to subsidize our economy can't really be justified in situations where there's an emergency. And the auxiliary reserve that U.S. shipping requirements supposedly support, it's never been called up. In fact, the majority of U.S. ships that move food aid are not even militarily useful. Those that are, ultimately, those are foreign owned. They're not owned by U.S. shipping companies. For the past 3 years, we have been fighting to advance common sense solutions that would enable the U.S. to reach more people in less time at less expense, and we've been fighting to put the emphasis back on saving lives. We've made some progress, but it's not enough. If we allowed for just 25% of the Food for Peace budget to be used for more flexible food aid approaches when there is an emergency, like local purchase or vouchers or transfers, we could reduce our response time from months to hours and reach at least 2 million more people with life-saving aid. If we bumped that number up to 45%, we could reach 6 million more. As we will hear today, we are in desperate need to do better. We need to embrace common sense reforms that allow us to use the right tool at the right time in the right place. With that, I will turn to Mr. Engel after he arrives, after the testimony of our 4 witnesses, and let me introduce Mr. Dan Glickman. Many of us know him as the former Secretary of Agriculture from March '95 until January 2001, and he served in the House for 18 years, representing the 4th District of Kansas. Dr. Raj Shah served as the 16th Administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development, where he led the Feed the Future and Power Africa initiatives. Dr. Chris Barrett teaches economics at Cornell University. Dr. Barrett has won several national and international awards for his research, which focuses on international agricultural development and on poverty reduction. Reverend David Beckman has been president of Bread for the World since 1991, during which time he has fought to overcome hunger around the planet. He was recognized with the World Food Prize for his contributions, and we appreciate this distinguished panel here today. Without objection, the witnesses' full prepared statements will be made part of the record. Members here will have 5 calendar days to submit any statements or any questions or any extraneous materials for the record. And Mr. Glickman, please summarize your remarks, if you will, Mr. Secretary. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Royce. It's an honor to be here to see former colleagues. I served with Dana Rohrabacher. I think it was on the House Science Committee a long time ago. We both look pretty good, but it was a long time ago. Yeah, and then, of course, Karen Bass just recently accompanied several of your colleagues on a visit to Tanzania as part of the Aspen Institute. So I'm delighted to be here. And I think I'm really here as much in my former role as Secretary of Agriculture and as a congressman from Kansas and an agriculture guy who sometimes agriculture and humanitarian interests are not necessarily on the same wavelength as it relates to the issue of food aid reform and flexibility. And so I just wanted to give you my thoughts, and thank you so much for having this hearing, which is extremely important. I do agree with you, Mr. Chairman, that offering more flexibility in how food aid is distributed will allow the U.S. to feed more hungry people more quickly while empowering them to, over time, feed themselves. My first point I would make is in the last decade, changes in the number and nature of conflicts, humanitarian disasters, massive migration, and refugee crises are forcing the United States and the world at large to rethink old paradigms about how we can deliver food assistance effectively and efficiently. This year, for the first time in history, we are facing 4 Level 3 humanitarian crises: Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and South Sudan. More than ever before, our food aid resources are strained. And not too long ago, the head of the World Food Program said that we did not have enough resources, either the United States or the world, to provide adequate food assistance to the refugees in Syria. This is a big problem, and it's an important problem for the United States because we provide roughly about half of the food assistance in the world, and we're viewed as a great leader. So to alleviate short-term hunger in both emergency and non-emergency situations, the U.S. needs a range of food and aid tools, including food vouchers, local and regional purchase, in-kind support, and in some cases, direct cash assistance. These tools have all been introduced on at least a limited basis over the past decade. My colleague and friend Raj Shah has done a transformational job at USAID trying to do this within the statutory authority that we're given. But as you point out, Mr. Chairman, statutory limitations often prevent policymakers from choosing the tool that will best meet food needs for the greatest number of people. Traditionally, food has been sourced from American growers. That was in part based upon constant surpluses after the Second World War, surpluses in corn and wheat and soybeans. And farmers have deep humanitarian ties to the rest of the world. But those surpluses drove the need for food aid based upon the direct transfer of crops and commodities. Those times have changed, as you point out. Supply and demand are in much better equilibrium around the world, and the inhibitions that you have pointed out through cargo preference, the NGO process of monetization, are not necessary these days like they might have been 20 or 30 years ago. The complex nature of emergencies today and the circumstances driving chronic hunger have rendered these approaches more inefficient than other delivery methods. Further, the food aid program no longer yields the same benefits to American agriculture and shipping industries as it once did. In fact, the whole scheme of humanitarian assistance and its resources and infrastructure, both how the U.S. does it and the rest of the world, is not up to the task of today's problems, given the chronic crisis we have. Evidence suggests, however, that an important step in the right direction is to make America's food aid program far more flexible and to favor a cash-based approach to ensure that we get the most mileage out of every food aid dollar invested. And this is not a one-size-fits-all. We will still need to provide commodities, as we did in Haiti, as we did in the Philippines. That's got to be part of our arsenal, but the statutory restrictions on how much commodities are given and under what circumstances are really hurting our ability to help people around the world. And those points have been made, I think, by everybody here who is talking about it. So, and in my testimony, I talk about the range of changing in tools in terms of cargo preference, in terms of monetization that need to be done. But I want to finish my testimony as the former Secretary of Agriculture. I want to emphasize that U.S. agriculture can and should be seen as an important partner in meeting food needs. Introducing more flexibility into America's food aid program will not negatively impact the vast majority of U.S. food producers, but a failure to leverage the strengths of the U.S. agriculture and food sector will negatively affect our ability to advance food security. Food aid was responsible for about $1 billion out of $152 billion in commodity exports last fiscal year. A recent report by the American Enterprise Institute calculated that the share of U.S. corn production the previous 6 years used for food aid was less than 0.1%, and only 0.5% of corn exports were due to food aid programs. Because of global aid, global trade, other issues that are coming up, the need for U.S. agriculture to benefit directly from the shipment of American commodities overseas is not as great as it used to be before. And in fact, it has a negative impact on our ability to serve the world. So look, American agriculture has a lot to gain by stronger economies around the world, greater exports generally, bigger purchases of U.S. agriculture and fertilizer and related products, and a much stronger worldwide economy will allow U.S. producers to benefit rather dramatically. So it really is in our interest to make these food aid programs more sensible and more flexible, and that's the bottom line in all of this. It does not hurt American agriculture. It ultimately will help American agriculture rather dramatically. So I urge this committee to consider U.S. agriculture a partner in pursuing food aid reforms, to talk to people within the agriculture community, to find ways that we can work through some of the politics of these problems, but at the same time recognizing to feed a hungry world and to save millions of lives, we do need to make these programs much more flexible than they currently are. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Secretary, Raj.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to commend you for your extraordinary leadership on this issue, also Congressman Engel and so many other friends and colleagues on this panel. The Pope's recent visit reminded us that America's role as the world's leader in humanitarian affairs really is a signal part of our national security and global presence. Of course, our humanitarian history is that we started as a great humanitarian nation internationally with food assistance, sending surplus American commodities abroad after the Surplus Commodity Act. This legacy has fed more than 3 billion people over 60 years, and as Secretary Glickman points out, and has done so much to preserve this legacy, this is an extraordinary, extraordinary achievement. But today we have many, many food crises that are not just food crises. The fact that there are so many hungry children, women, and families in Syria is not just a food crisis, it is creating a refugee crisis that contributes to destabilizing that region. The fact that so many young children, more than 1,000 in the camps in South Sudan, have telltale orange hair because they're so acutely malnourished and on the verge of starvation is not just a humanitarian priority, it is leading to instability throughout that region. And the fact that our presence and capacity to support those in Nepal is diminished because of our lack of flexibility in how we conduct our food assistance is also not just a moral issue, it has security and stability consequences. And today we're having this debate in a context where we know a lot of the evidence around whether or not reform and flexibility in the food assistance program works. We have evidence that shows that targeting the most vulnerable children with vouchers, often sent electronically on SMS texts on their mobile phone, actually saves their lives in crises far more effectively than shipping American food and trucking it into communities where that kind of targeting capacity is not possible. To just put it in perspective, the Somalia famine of 2011, which I take as one of the most, in my view, meaningful moments of my tenure at USAID, would have led to more than 100,000 children dying. In fact, 35,000 children already had died before the targeting and the SMS program went into place. And then the child deaths came down so fast and so effectively that we virtually stopped child death from that famine the moment we put that program in place. We could only do that because of flexibility that we had in other programs. Shipping over U.S. grain is now known to be less valuable than feeding children with these ready-to-use supplemental and therapeutic foods. This little packet of peanut butter-like paste, which doesn't taste quite as good as peanut butter, having had some, resuscitates children so much faster and so much more effectively than giving them corn soy blend or any of the other more traditional food assistance products. These products are created in New Jersey and Texas and Rhode Island. I've met, along with Congressman Sisseline, the employees of these companies that are often refugees themselves, that take great pride in the fact that they're serving this country and our ability to project our values around the world. And we can do this in a way that creates American jobs and uses American knowledge and medical know-how to actually save lives. We know local purchase, as Chairman Royce mentioned, is faster and cheaper than the alternatives. It is 25% less costly in Tacloban, but also in every other crisis. The first few weeks and months of aid and assistance do not come from the traditional Food for Peace program. They come from a different pocket of resources that we use so that we can locally purchase and locally store food and meet needs when they're needed. And then Food for Peace comes in many months later using a program that was designed 6 decades ago. By the way, we also know that those efforts can be branded just as proudly. In fact, one of my favorite photos is from the Tacloban response when we had U.S. military personnel carrying a box of locally purchased foods that were labeled USAID, that said "from the American people," and that communicated the same sense of national pride and commitment as any other form of branding with respect to food assistance. And finally, we know that monetization in its current form is just a waste of money at best, and in reality is far more consequential in that it depresses prices for local farmers. When we ended monetization in Haiti, we immediately created incentives for tens of thousands of farm households to double their food yields. We then supplemented that effort with targeted feeding programs that reach the most vulnerable children. And today, 50% of child hunger has gone down. Child hunger is down by more than 50% in Haiti compared to the day before the earthquake. Not because we're using Food for Peace in its traditional form, but because we're ending some of the harmful practices of an antiquated program that sometimes causes more harm than benefit. This is real data. This was enabled by the Farm Bill's increasing flexibility that lets us test new approaches and see what's happening. It was enabled by the Bush administration's local and regional procurement program, which gave us the database to understand whether these new ways of working have effectiveness or not. And today we live in a world where this reform is politically achievable. Big agricultural companies like Cargill, growers like the National Farmers Union, policy experts from the left and the right, including the American Enterprise Institute, and even some of the largest shipping companies in the world have come together to say, let's do this differently because America's humanitarian leadership matters for our world, and they want to see it sustained in a different way in the future. So I welcome the opportunity to be with you, and I want to congratulate and thank you for your interest. I do believe the time is now to live up to the Pope's call. I think you can pass food aid reform in this body. I think you can pass Feed the Future and authorize that bipartisan legislation, which I understand now has nearly 80 co-sponsors, on its way to 100. And I think if you do those two things in this Congress, America's leadership in fighting hunger around the world will be sustained for the next decades, and it will be something we can all be very, very proud and grateful for. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shaw. Dr. Barrett?
Chairman Royce, honorable members, thank you very much for the opportunity to testify today and to summarize my written remarks. Let me come straight to the point. The body of research on food aid is extraordinarily clear. Restrictions imposed on U.S. international food aid programs waste taxpayer money at great human cost. Relative to the reformed programs operated by other countries' aid agencies and by private nonprofit agencies, the costs of U.S. food aid are excessive, delivery is slow, and the programs have not kept pace with global emergency needs. And there's no hard evidence that this benefits American agriculture, maritime employment, or military readiness. No debate remains among serious scholars who have studied the issue. U.S. food aid reform is long overdue. U.S. food aid is a limited and declining resource. Inflation-adjusted U.S. food aid spending has declined 80% since the mid-1960s high. Given limited resources, we simply must be much more strategic in using U.S. food aid resources. 4 statutory restrictions imposed on these programs waste money and cost lives. First, under the Food for Peace Act, it is required that agricultural commodities be bought in and shipped from the United States only. Perhaps that made sense back in 1954 for the reasons Secretary Glickman explained. But today, things are different. The government no longer holds large commodity stocks, and the resulting surplus disposal purpose no longer applies. Today, the most effective way to help hungry people is to provide them with cash or electronic transfers or with food purchased locally or regionally, so-called LRP. The peer-reviewed scientific evidence shows very clearly that LRP and cash or electronic transfers save time, money, and lives, while providing food that is equally safe and healthy and is in fact preferred by recipients over commodities shipped from the U.S. I go into further detail in my written comments. Second, at least 50% of U.S. food aid must be shipped on U.S. flagged vessels under cargo preference provisions. Recent studies find that cargo preference inflates ocean freight costs by 23 to 46% relative to open market freight rates. The net result is $40 to $50 million a year that is appropriated to help feed starving children that instead turns into windfall profits diverted to mainly foreign shipping lines. Third, at least 15% of non-emergency food aid must be monetized under current law. As the previous witnesses have explained, monetization is simply a waste of money. GAO estimates that inefficiency in monetization reduces the funding available for development projects by more than $70 million annually. Fourth, current law requires that between 20 and 30% of Food for Peace funding and no less than $350 million be available for non-emergency food aid. But with the number of people affected by disasters and war at an all-time high, there's simply insufficient food aid available to handle all the emergencies we face, where the bang for the food aid buck is greatest. That hard earmark is binding and limits America's capacity to respond to humanitarian emergencies around the world. Cumulatively, American taxpayers spend far more on shipping and handling than on food. Every taxpayer dollar spent on U.S. food aid generates only 35 to 40 cents worth of food commodity purchased. That doesn't go to hungry and disaster-affected people. 2/3 of it's going elsewhere. Canada, by contrast, has no such restrictions. It makes far more extensive use of LRP cash and electronic transfers. As a result, its taxpayers get roughly twice as much food for the taxpayer dollar, about 70 cents worth, as compared to our 35 to 40 cents. And what are the costs, the human costs of these wasteful restrictions on food aid? A very coarse, conservative estimate is that we sacrifice 40 to 45,000 children's lives each year because of the unnecessary costs associated with the restriction posed by antiquated food aid policies. Now, special interests claim that cargo preference advances military readiness, but that myth has been conclusively exploded by multiple careful recent studies that find the overwhelming majority of the agricultural cargo preference fleet is out of date and fails to satisfy DoD standards of military usefulness. In 60+ years of cargo preference, DoD has not once mobilized a mariner or a vessel from the non-maritime security program cargo preference fleet. Hence, the Department of Defense and Homeland Security's clear support for food aid reform in recent years. Proponents of the status quo also advance claims of maritime employment benefits. Yet the 2012 reduction in cargo preference coverage from 75% to 50% does not appear to have led to the ceasing of a single vessel's ocean freight services or the loss of any mariner jobs. And this type of indirect subsidy is so inefficient that any maritime job created comes at a taxpayer cost of roughly $100,000 a year. Moreover, the bulk of those windfall profits don't accrue to workers, they accrue to vessel owners. And a sizable majority of the vessel owners are actually foreign shipping lines running U.S. subsidiaries. So these windfall profits aren't even accruing to Americans. Some proponents of in-kind food aid claim that food aid purchase in the U.S. somehow helps American farmers. Secretary Glickman, I think, has addressed this quite well already. But there's not a single careful study that supports the claim that U.S. food aid helps America's farmers. The simple fact is that U.S. food aid programs procure only hundreds of million dollars worth of U.S. commodities in a several $100 billion U.S. agricultural economy that is very tightly integrated into a $4 trillion global market. U.S. food aid does not determine the prices farmers receive. The global market determines the prices farmers receive. U.S. food aid has done lots of good in 60+ years. It's an incredibly valuable resource for humanitarian response. It's a highly visible symbol of Americans' commitment to feed the world's hungry. But we can do better. We can do much better if Congress will provide the USAID administrator and the Secretary of Agriculture with the flexibility to employ best practices through 4 reforms. First, relax the restriction against cash-based international food assistance. Second, eliminate the statutory minimum on monetization of non-emergency food aid. Third, eliminate the hard earmark that protects less productive non-emergency food aid over emergency assistance. And fourth, eliminate cargo preference. Honorable members, you have a choice. You can keep the status quo and keep diverting U.S. taxpayer money from disaster-affected children to foreign companies, or you can enact changes that will help save the world's hungry far more efficiently, effectively, and quickly. Thank you very much for your time and attention and for taking up this very valuable activity.
Thank you. Reverend Beckman. David, if you just hit that red
Thank you,
button.
Chairman Royce and members of the committee. Bread for the World is a nationwide network of individuals and church bodies that encourage Congress to do things that will help hungry people in our country and around the world. And I want to thank this committee for your leadership on this issue of food aid reform, also on the related but separate issue of the Global Food Security Act. I think they should be kept separate. But in both of these are both areas of legislation that are clearly important to the world's continued progress against hunger, and I'm grateful. In my written testimony, I explain why Bread for the World supports the things we're talking about here: more flexibility for local regional purchase, loosening the cargo preference restrictions, and eliminating monetization. I just think the evidence is so clear that if we could have reform of food aid, we'd have more efficient, more effective food assistance. In my oral testimony, I'd like to focus on the relationship of food aid to three broader concerns. The first one is the current surge in humanitarian need. Most of this is because of the war in Syria. But there is also severe humanitarian need in Iraq, Yemen, Sudan, Central African Republic. The resources are just not keeping up with the need. I'm struck that we're cutting back on food rations for Syrian refugees. You know, just from a national security point of view, it does not make sense to cut back on food ration for Syrian refugees. And food aid reform is one way of stretching our dollars to meet the increased need that we face right now for humanitarian assistance. I'd also like to talk about the connection of food aid to American agriculture. I grew up in Nebraska. In fact, I just flew back from a visit to my family in Nebraska, so I share in the deep sense of satisfaction, almost a religious sense of connection between the production of food in this country and the needs of hungry people in our country and around the world. But food aid isn't any longer economically important to American agriculture. What is important to American agriculture is the fact that the world is making dramatic progress against hunger and extreme poverty. The escape of hundreds of millions of people from extreme poverty means that there are a lot more people in the world who are eating adequately, and that creates an expanding and dynamic market for U.S. agriculture. So I think that's the basis for the ongoing and continuing alliance between U.S. agricultural community and the interests of hungry people in our country and around the world. There have been questions raised about committee jurisdiction. That's important, but it's not pressing in the same way that reform of the programs is pressing. And so I hope you can handle that question of committee jurisdiction in a way that doesn't hold up the reform process. Finally, I want to talk about food aid reform in relationship to the world's extraordinary progress against hunger, poverty, and disease. I'm a preacher, so I think this progress that's happening is an experience of our loving God in our own history. When the Pope was here, as Raj said, he talked a lot about people in need. When he talked to Congress, he specifically celebrated the progress that the world is now making against poverty. And he said, "The fight against poverty and hunger must be fought constantly and on many fronts. Reforming food aid is one way to fight hunger, and using it as one way to move toward the virtual end of hunger in our times is certainly sacred business.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
We'll go now to Mr. Elliot Engel for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for calling this hearing. And you know, as the ranking member, I want to just say that this is another wonderful example of the bipartisanship of the Foreign Affairs Committee. Thank you for bringing the committee's focus to the pressing need to reform our food aid program. And we're fortunate, of course, and we've heard from them, to have a panel of experts who have dealt with this issue inside government, in the NGO world, in academic settings. So I want to say to all our witnesses, thank you for sharing your views, and welcome to the Foreign Affairs Committee. I want to single out Dr. Shah, who I had the pleasure of working with for many years with the USAID, and it's good to see you again, Raj, and welcome you. And Dan Glickman, who by the time I came to Congress 27 years ago was already a rising star in Congress, or actually he was already a star, not even rising, and then served as the distinguished Secretary of Agriculture. And it's really great to see you as well, Dan. Dr. Barrett, Reverend Beckman, your legend precedes you. So this is just a wonderful panel, and we're so fortunate to have all of you here today. Let's note at the outset, the world is better off because of the Food for Peace program. Since its launch in the 1950s, this effort's fed more than 1 billion people in more than 150 countries. It has saved countless lives. Food for Peace is something that we should all be proud, of which we should all be proud. But we should also be honest. Food for Peace is now showing its age. It was designed to meet challenges in a much different world. For example, the majority of our food aid in developing countries must be bought and shipped from the United States, even when local food is available at a lower price. In the 1950s, this made sense. The federal government had a massive surplus of food on its hands. Food for Peace was a smart way to help those in need and to prevent needless waste. But today we don't have that surplus of food. What's more, buying food and transporting it from the U.S. to a crisis zone costs almost 50% more than purchasing food products locally. And that's not a very good bang for our buck. And when we're talking about feeding hungry people, every little bit obviously counts. So to make matters worse, under our current program, it takes 4 to 6 months longer for food to reach hungry people than it would if we bought food locally. Raj Shah and I had many of these discussions when he was USAID administrator. To put it in the simplest terms, the Food for Peace program is slow, it's costly, and it's not doing enough to get food to people who are hungry and dying. So we need to take a fresh look at this program. After all, even though the world has changed a great deal, obviously the need for food assistance hasn't. A refugee crisis in Syria is spilling from the Middle East into Europe and onto our own shores. A devastating earthquake in Nepal has left thousands in desperate need of help. And of course, with each passing year, we're feeling the far-reaching effects of climate change more and more. Hurricanes and typhoons of unprecedented destructive power, even as historic droughts endanger the global food supply. So we need to take a fresh look at the program. We need to make sure food aid is tailored to meet the challenges of our time. The administration has put forth suggestions, so have lawmakers, and let me acknowledge Chairman Royce for his leadership in particular on this issue. The common theme in these proposals is flexibility. Sometimes it will make the most sense to buy American agriculture and to contract with American shippers to get food where it needs to go. Sometimes buying local products will get us the best outcome. We need a program flexible enough to respond in the best way on a case-by-case basis. Today, I am looking forward to hearing our witnesses answer questions. I want to hear the ideas about what this program looks like and the right way to put it together. In particular, I'd like to focus on the benefits of a cash-based system versus in-kind commodity donations, on new methods of delivery, and on local and regional procurement programs. Reforming a long-standing government program is never an easy task, but the need for these changes is clear. It goes back to why we have a food aid program in the first place, not to subsidize growers, shippers, or NGOs, but to prevent men, women, and children in the developing world from starving to death. So let's work toward building a new program that meets this critical demand in the most efficient and effective way for the American taxpayer. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your courtesy.
Thank you, Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel raises the issue, Dr. Shaw, of flexibility in this. Maybe you could give us an example of when you were director and how, in a given situation, a little more flexibility would have gone a long way in terms of responding.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And you know, I would note what David said. In Syria and in neighboring countries, you had a lot of Syrian refugees leaving Syria, going into Jordan and Lebanon. And they're not living in camps, they're living in neighborhoods and communities. And in that context, physically finding them inside of apartment buildings and in low-income housing situations and taking to them food or having them come with some special designation to pick up American food is both deeply inefficient, upsetting to everybody else in the neighborhood, and difficult for local businesses that are, you know, dependent on the local food economy. So with the World Food Program, we work to let them use, not through Food for Peace, but other programs, vouchers that would go to those households. And I met with mothers and children, but the mothers would say, these vouchers, which say, from the American people, they have the USAID logo on them, they say, these are saving our lives right now. I don't know where my husband is. He you know, may have perished in the fighting inside of Syria, but my 4 children and I are sustained here because we can take these vouchers to local stores. And by the way, the local merchants and local communities are less upset about the big influx of refugees because they're contributing now to the local economy. The fact that we've run out of money basically for this kind of approach and are now stuck with just commodity food is why you're hearing about the cuts that David highlighted. And to me, this is a national security issue. This is the heart of where refugees are pouring from this region into the rest of Europe and elsewhere, causing real instability. So we are undermining our own capacity to do what we know is right and has worked because we don't have the flexibility.
And let me ask Secretary Glickman, because Dr. Barrett, in his testimony, said Canada uses a different approach and gets roughly twice the benefit in terms of the amount of food aid on the ground in these situations. You noted the GAO study that says that shipping food from the U.S. to sub-Saharan Africa took 100 days on average longer than procuring food from regional sources in cases of emergency and such. So we're not the only ones providing food aid around the world. Maybe you could share with us how other top donors like Europe and Canada and Japan structure their food aid.
Nobody structures their food aid exactly like we do, that's for sure. And but you know, in history, you know, I remember looking at magazines like Time Magazine and others, and you know, we advertised that all of this overseas food were American grain going in American bags. And, you know, I remember as a kid seeing all of that. You all probably do too as well. And so the impression is that these were important humanitarian products that were moving from a farm in Texas or Oklahoma or Kansas or Ohio or wherever directly to people overseas. And I think that has had an impact politically, accompanied by the cargo preference thing, to a kind of resistance of wanting to make the programs more flexible. It's almost become ideological or religious in some circles, that this is kind of part of the history. But other countries, Canada is a huge producer of commodities, wheat, corn, cotton, wheat and corn, not so much cotton, but grain, sorghum, some soybeans, and then legumes and pulse crops and everything else. And they've just got a more flexible way of dealing with the problem. They can get their crops there faster. But
And
we
you
still provide half the food
Yeah.
aid in the world, roughly, the United States of America.
You mentioned also, and maybe I'll go to Dr. Barrett for this, the cargo preference vessels being a factor in this. And Dr. Barrett, what is the setup of these corporations? You mentioned that they're not American owned, so how are they able to take advantage of U.S. law in this respect, and how does that figure in the calculus here?
You know, Mr. Chairman, the law requires that the vessels fly a U.S. flag and follow all U.S. laws and regulations. They don't require that the ultimate equity holders be American. And so foreign corporations, 3 in particular, own 45% of the U.S. agricultural cargo preference fleet. Foreign corporations can set up U.S. subsidiaries, purchase a vessel, flag it with a U.S. flag, follow all U.S. law, but the profits reaped by those vessels accrue to the subsidiary and pass right on through to the foreign corporation that ultimately holds the subsidiary.
I see. My time's expired. I need to go to Mr. Engel for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me ask Dr. Shah. There's an ongoing debate over the use of cash-based food assistance, whether it's cash or food vouchers. I obviously, and you as well, know the benefits, timeliness of food getting to desperate people, and it's less costly to implement. But opponents argue that this is susceptible to fraud. Let me ask you, with retina and other biometric scans and mobile tracking data and other technologies, how secure is a cash-based system? We hear of success stories like the one in Zatri refugee camps in Jordan. There's a market where people can buy and select their food, giving them some semblance of dignity. Aren't we one of the few remaining major donor countries to hold on to an in-kind food donation system?
Well, thank you. And yes, we are the only major donor that continues to send our food as opposed to our resources, and that impinges the capacity to be successful for all of the implementing partners. I'd note on security of electronic vouchers and paper vouchers, at this point, we now have 8 years of history doing this. So before, it was debatable to say, oh, is this going to be less secure or less effective? What we now know is that this is probably more secure because you can target the household. You don't get convoys being attacked because you're not sending convoys of cash. You're sending an electronic payment through a secure system to a vulnerable household. And by the way, the alternative are the food shipments are often attacked. And that speaks to the security risks of doing this work in increasingly challenging, conflict-affected environments. So there really is no debate anymore about is this more secure or less secure. It is clearly as or more secure. There's also no debate about is it effective or less effective. It is far more effective. It's certainly more efficient, but it also allows us to do a better job of targeting the most vulnerable families and children within a community. And that was basically the example of Somalia. It's like once you had that targeting done well, you could make a huge, huge difference in child death through a famine very, very, very quickly. And you would never be able to do that if you had the physical responsibility of providing people with actual food that came from the United States.
Thank you. Let me ask Secretary Glickman, when the Food for Peace program was initiated back in the 1950s, obviously the landscape for American food aid was much different than it is today. There were high agricultural surpluses, low prices. They were threatened. That was threatening the security of U.S. farmers. The U.S. shipping industry was in decline, and food needs around the world were ever increasing. What is different now, and in your opinion, why would reform be a big plus for American agriculture?
Surpluses of the major commodity crops are no longer nearly as great. There are still some crops with surpluses episodically, periodically, but overall we are dealing with supply and demand in the world, as Dr. Barrett talked about, a global world which is much more in sync and in equilibrium. So therefore the need to use surpluses to, let's say, bring down supplies to get price up is no longer anywhere near what it was before, and it probably has no impact on the price, as Dr. Barrett says. These are global markets, and the amount of food aid and the total amount of exports of corn and wheat and sorghum particularly is extraordinarily small.
Thank you. Let me get back to Dr. Shah. Dr. Shah, you and I, during the Haiti crisis, talked a great deal about what we should do in Haiti, and I visited there a number of times, and we talked about this. So the earthquake there really impacted us all. The people of the region obviously are still suffering the destruction today. I've seen firsthand how the sale of American rice under the Food for Peace program there drove local rice farmers out of business, making it harder for the Haitians to feed themselves. So if we had enacted the reforms to food aid before the earthquake hit Haiti 5 years ago, how would our response to this tragedy have been better, and how would it have been different in other disaster situations?
Well, we have a very specific answer to that question because as a result of using non-Food for Peace assistance tools, and shutting down Food for Peace, American food handouts, we were able, and monetization in particular, we were able to basically test and answer exactly what would happen. And we saw what would happen. We've seen a more than doubling of farm production in Haiti as a result of taking away the dumping of American food and enabling and supporting those farmers to have access to better science and technology through Feed the Future. We've seen voucher programs like the one implemented by CARE International that target the most vulnerable households and children, give them a biometrically secure card, as you point out, and then allow their children to get access to the kinds of foods people need when they're malnourished, not just bags of rice, which, as we know, has very limited total nutritional value for a starving child. And the result has been proven in the Demographic and Health Survey, which is by far, it's frankly the only, it's also the best actual survey out there to tell you what's happening. And acute malnutrition in Haiti is 50% lower today amongst children than it was the day before the earthquake. This could happen everywhere we do the work if we had food aid reform. Because we know we have the science, we have the technology, we have the know-how, and frankly, we have the capacity to study the impacts, and we know how to do this. It's just the program is designed 60 years ago, and we keep doing the same things we did 60 years ago.
Let me just, with the Chairman's indulgence, pivot back to Secretary Glickman about this. Critics argue that buying food in country instead of delivering U.S. commodities actually undermines the message of U.S. generosity and goodwill to those in need. So I don't believe that, but I want to hear what you believe. Do you believe that USAID can still send the message that the U.S. is a partner for development and here to help those in need around the world while being more flexible in how it spends U.S. food assistance dollars?
I do. Saying that, I think that I'm not one that would eliminate in-kind assistance totally, because I think there is a role for U.S. commodities when it can't be purchased locally, or when the voucher program doesn't work, or you have these imminent emergencies like we had in Haiti or other places. However, American generosity is real. Just one example, on this conference we went in Tanzania that Congresswoman Bass went with me on. What struck me about this was the positive feelings about the United States of America. There's Chinese investment all over Tanzania, mostly in infrastructure, but some in agriculture and some in sanitation and water, but mostly in infrastructure. And yet the clear acknowledgement from people we went to was American generosity writ large is profoundly agreed to, well respected, and it's one of the few places in the world I've been to where I honestly believe we are very popular in terms of what we do. And I think in large part that's due to the totality of American assistance in health, which is a big thing, started with President Bush and Bill Gates and others, in agriculture, in education and infrastructure. There's still a whole litany of problems to be solved there, but I don't view this issue as hurting our ability to be a positive influence.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We go now to Congressman Dana Rohrabacher from California.
Thank you very much. We define ourselves very much by the things that we do and not necessarily what we say or what we'd like to have other people think about us, but by we actually pay attention to and try to get done. And let me commend Chairman Royce. Since he's been here, he has made his priority, first was reforming freedom broadcasting that America does. That was his #1 goal here, and worked so hard on that, and has had an impact on that. And the second thing that he's made it his priority has been reforming American food aid. And he fought a big fight on this on the floor. I backed him up, I want you to know. And so I think we can be very proud of those values, Ed, and very proud to serve with you. We need to restructure American foreign aid. I don't think that we can give grants to people, frankly, anymore, that in a way of basically expanding American interests around the world. Foreign aid, I think, has to go from nation building And in many of those cases in the past, what we've done is sustain poverty rather than break the chain of poverty and help special interests in various groups. That I believe foreign aid needs to be a emergency response to the world in times of natural catastrophe, times when things are really desperate for people, we could come and help, and we got to expect America to be able to do that. I don't think that we can be a nation-building organization for everywhere in the world anymore. We just can't afford it. I would suggest that when there is a natural catastrophe or some upheaval, that would be what we'd want to do, because, Reverend, it's not just up to God. How God makes himself part of what we do in this planet is to work through those who believe in God, and God inspires us to do good works. So that's how there's not going to be a lightning bolt from heaven solving these problems. Dr. Shaw, I really want to know about that packet, because I know you've been waving it at us, and I will tell you that that makes sense to me. Is that packet, say you can give that packet to some starving child, and that will prevent a starvation of a child?
Yes, sir. This is based on a product called Plumpy Nut. It's a peanut paste, which is very high protein. What happens, and Dan and I and so many others have been to these places where you have a child who can barely hold up their head. They're in a dusty camp in, Dadaab, where they've just come out of Somalia. And instead of mixing in that setting water, corn, soy blend, and producing a porridge that is frankly low in protein, you can give them a pre-prepared food that is much, much, much more effective at resuscitating them very quickly. And they will go in 2 to 3 weeks, as little as 10 days actually, of targeted feeding. They will go from looking like they're on the verge of death to being a sort of fat-faced, smiling little kid that has been resuscitated. And that's just knowledge, technology, and know-how.
And can we produce this in such numbers as it makes sense economically to do that, as compared to making that porridge?
Absolutely. We make this in Rhode Island. We can make this all over this country. And frankly, left to its own devices, 10 years from now, in my view, we should be sending almost no bags of grain. I mean, it's just not 1954. I mean, we should be sending targeted, nutritionally enhanced foods that resuscitate children as
How much
they
does
need
that
to.
packet cost then?
So I don't know the actual cost of the different products. Some are for supplementary feeding,
Yes.
some are for therapeutic feeding, which means children who are right on the verge of starvation.
What about the nutritional thing, just that basic thing that you were mentioning?
The nutritional
Yes.
impact of this?
Yes. No. How much does that cost?
Oh, well, I'd say I'd put it this way: 10 days or 2 weeks of targeted feeding with newer technologies like this is a much more cost-effective way of resuscitating a child than shipping over a bag of grain, mixing it with water, feeding them porridge, and by the way, but even more in the cost, because you have to sustain that activity for months in order for them to be resuscitated off of porridge. That's why we wouldn't do this in the United States.
Because you mentioned it didn't taste as good as peanut butter, they'll want to go to their own local food as soon as they can, and as soon as that's available.
It's just a little dense. They make it so that the kids like it, but it's a little dense if you or I were tasting it.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank all of you for your good hearts and trying to get us to do something positive out of Congress here.
Thank you. Karen Bass, California.
Let me join in thanking the chair and the ranking member for this hearing and also for your leadership on this issue. And like the ranking member said, I think it's another example of how this committee works in a very bipartisan fashion. I've had the opportunity in several countries, Tanzania, Ethiopia, Kenya. Mr. Glickman mentioned the trip to Tanzania recently. It is really inspiring to meet with local communities, local villages, and see how they have moved from subsistence farming to now turning a profit and actually being able to develop their villages and share that knowledge. And I think it's an incredible example of how we can make a contribution that is not just a one-time contribution of let me give you some food, but let me share our scientific knowledge in farming so that you can become independent and productive on your own. So I'm a big supporter. There's no question about that. And it's wonderful to see you back with us, Dr. Shaw. You seem so much more relaxed. and Mr. Glickman and the other panelists, really appreciate your time today. But I want to raise some questions that have been raised by my colleagues who are either not sure whether they support a change in policy or actually differ with it. And you've made reference to some of these points, but I wanted you to draw out and articulate it more. One of my colleagues is concerned about the maritime employment, and specifically because there is a school in his district for merchant marines. And he is worried that if we make further changes in the program, that then there will not be the jobs for merchant marines. So I want to know if you would talk about that. Other members are concerned about the money when it says that we're going to hand out cash. They're worried about the accountability and how we manage that. Dr. Shaw, you mentioned that it's electronic transfers, and I'm wondering how that takes place specifically, in countries like Somalia or in rural areas. You talked about problems with monetization, the current program. If you could describe that and the change that needs to be made. So I would just throw that open to the panel. For anyone that would like to answer.
Well, thank you, and thank you for your leadership. Maybe I'll go backwards through these. So monetization, just to be clear on what this is, I want to offer an example about a program we actually ran in the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, to get money to an NGO to help them protect women and girls in a farm community in eastern Congo that was characterized by strife. We were buying food in the American Midwest, shipping it, I believe, out of Louisiana, then watching it go all the way to Africa, having ground transport from the port to eastern Congo, selling it on the market in eastern Congo, thus depressing the local prices of the only financial activity folks there do, which is farm, taking the cash, of which there was 42 cents on the dollar left, and giving it to a local NGO. It was the most, and granted it's one example, and I think on average monetization only makes something like 30% of the money just disappear, but so this is an extreme example, but the fact that we were doing this struck me as totally ridiculous, and so that's just what monetization actually is and what it looks like, and maybe 50 years ago, you were introducing that local community to American wheat such that you were creating an export market for the American food industry. The American farmers today would not want you to be doing that in Eastern Congo. They would care more about those girls than they would that someday they're buying our wheat. On the money and the electronic transfers, rural Kenya is a good example, but they have an M-Pesa program where you literally text money by SMS text. You can, everyone, even the poorest households in the most rural, most difficult migratory part of that country have M-Pesa accounts and mobile phones. You can get them the resources very quickly. They can cash it in for food, and it just works. And when we have data from all over the world showing it works, it's secure, it's not wasted at all. And I think it's actually more efficient and more secure than trying to send food into northeast Kenya. And then on maritime employment, I'll let Dr. Barrett comment on it, but I will point out we did a very careful analysis. The ships in the program that are they're literally called militarily non-useful ships that are just dependent on food aid. I actually had my team at USAID show me the photos of the ships. You should ask them for the photos, because all you got to do is look at them and you'll say, there's no way, if the American military depends on these ships to keep us safe and secure, we have a larger challenge than food aid efficiency. And the number of mariners that are on the actual ships used that are in the non-militarily useful category, which are the highly dependent ones, is negligible. It's a very, very small number. It's in the tens. It's like 70 or 80. And the maritime leaders I spoke to in the United States and around the world were more than willing to be flexible in order to create a more effective humanitarian picture. These are huge companies. They make $60 billion a year. They don't want the negative publicity of their position on these issues is probably more harmful to them than the $20, $30 million of profit when you're making $60 billion a year.
Mr. Chairman, can I ask just one more question? I think you were going to respond, Dr. Barrett, but before you do, Dr. Shaw, you've made reference several times to the data, and it would be nice if we could see that in a couple of pages with some of those statistics highlighted. And it's just really, all of this has been an incredible accomplishment during your tenure.
Mr. Chairman, if I may. Congresswoman Bass, you ask really important questions. It's important to keep in mind that in 1996, the Congress enacted a new program, the Maritime Security Program, designed to ensure that militarily useful vessels were available to the Department of Defense for sea lift capacity. So vessels that are militarily useful get $3.1 million per year as effectively a call option on vessel and crew. Very few of those vessels are mobilized, but they have been mobilized. For example, in the Gulf War, we've had a few in use in recent years as well. That provides the vehicle originally intended under cargo preference and ensures that only militarily useful vessels are being paid for their services and their crews. Now, maritime employment is a slightly different issue from military readiness and sea lift capacity. It's crucial to keep in mind that we've just run an experiment. In 2012, the Congress reduced the cargo preference provision from 75% to 50%. So we've just run an experiment in reducing cargo preference. What employment effect did it have in the maritime sector? Zero. Absolutely none. There are no documented vessels that came out of service because of a reduction of agricultural cargo preference coverage, no losses of mariner jobs or onshore jobs associated with maritime for our agricultural cargo preference. The reason is the Jones Act that regulates coastwise trade has a 38,000 vessel fleet. There are an enormous number of vessels plying American waters with mariners who handle cargoes just like those in agricultural cargo preference. That is a rapidly growing coastwise trade. It is a far larger source of employment. Agricultural cargo preference is a drop in the ocean for maritime employment. And having just run this experiment, we know that it doesn't actually have an impact. Thank you.
Thank you. We go to Randy Weber of Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Shaw, you said M-Pesa accounts in Kenya. M-P-E-S-A?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and that stands for?
I'm not sure. That's a good question. The M, I think, is mobile, and Pesa must be referenced to currency.
Yeah, pesa is the Swahili word for money, and the M prefix in Swahili is for person. It literally means money man.
Okay, well, being from Texas, I'm used to peso. I'm just not used to pesa. I guess that makes sense. How do you protect against fraud? You said it's secure, and you said it's a good system, but, you know, these hackers and these internet thieves are very, very capable and very, very, you know, creative. How do you protect against that?
Well, I just say the comparison is against shipping American food. And, you know, a truck filled with American food is a more vulnerable target and has been proven to be a more vulnerable target than an electronic transfer that goes through an M-Pesa system or an alternative system like that.
I guess that makes sense, and also it's a bit more protective of the personnel involved. It's hard to get somebody shooting at you through the internet. Okay, well, good. Secretary Glickman, I represent the second largest rice producing district in Texas. And rice is a commodity often used in U.S. food aid programs. Now, these packets, and by the way, what was this second packet?
And then this, what was this here?
There are actually three products. One is the supplementary food, which is the plum peanut that I think is made in Rhode Island. One is the therapeutic version of it, which is a much denser, more richer version of the same.
Gotcha. You said that. Okay.
This is a cracker that, or a cookie that is also enhanced.
All right. Thank you. Last week, Jamie Warshaw with USA Rice testified before my counterparts on the Agricultural Committee regarding the strong amount of good that comes with a bag of rice that reads from the American people. Now, if I understand correctly, you just said that you would believe that in 10 years, no more grain is being shipped over there. Secretary Glickman, as Secretary of the Agriculture, you were directly behind much of the international food aid contributions. You believe that that got us goodwill. So large bag of grain, rice, or whatever, is there a mix here? Do you think this gets us as much goodwill? What's your take on
I
it?
think there's a mix. I don't think we're going to eliminate in-kind assistance forever, everywhere in the world. There's just too much stuff that's been in the politics lately. But there's too much stuff happening.
Forgive the pun, there's too much
know,
stuff that's
and,
been ingrained.
And bad stuff. That ingrained. No, there's too many things happening with respect. I was thinking about if the South Carolina tragic flooding had happened, which has happened in Taiwan or in South Korea or in Central America. We just had this problem in Guatemala last week with massive floods. We would be shipping some in-kind assistance. There's just no question about it. So, but it's a mix, and it requires flexibility. It requires judgment. And yeah, I think it probably helps the U.S. to have that physical commodity go there, but that's not the prime reason we ought to be doing it, because you also will get the similar benefit on the products that you're seeing there, because they will say product or help from the American people or USAID or whatever. So.
Okay, and then finally, with the development food aid programs targeting the most poor and chronically hungry communities, and having impressive results shown by the USAID Commission Second Food Act and Food Security Assessment, and important linkages with Feed the Future, we want to be careful not to lose such unique programs and tools that have become vital and effective within the range of our global food security strategy. So I know we have tremendous pressures to respond to significant humanitarian crises, but with development program waiver language in Section 300 of Senate Bill 525's Food Aid Reform Bill, have we reached the point where we need to allow the USA to waive those fragile developmental gains of the Title II development programs to create those more emergency response programs? Do we need to change that? Any of you?
If I may, absolutely, Congressman Weber. It's important to keep in mind it costs about $125 for treating children's severe acute malnutrition with the sorts of products that Dr. Shaw showed.
$125 per
child life year saved.
Per year?
That's a per year. So that's a relatively modest investment. You compare that against the cost of delivering grain from purchase in the United States. We're talking something on the order of 11 or 12 children's lives per shipment, just the excess cost of shipments. And keep in mind that providing the Secretary of Agriculture and the AID administrator with flexibility doesn't say U.S. agriculture won't participate. We're the most productive agricultural economy in the world. We're the world's largest agricultural exporter. The rice farmers in your district, sir, will continue to ship rice to these very places, providing, in many cases, the rice that will be bought locally, because they're the most efficient farmers in the world right now. The key thing is being able to buy the best quality product at the best price at the time it's most needed. And American agriculture and American food producers, manufacturers, millers, can play a very valuable role in that with no impediment whatsoever. And for just $125 per child life year, we'll get a much better product for the productivity of American industry and agriculture. To me, it's a no-brainer, sir.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Chair recognizes Mr. Cicilline.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you, Chairman Engel and Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel for this really important hearing on an issue that is literally a question of life and death. I think there is nothing more important in our humanitarian assistance than food, because without proper access to food and nutrition, children cannot live and attend school, men and women can't work, mothers can't take care of their children. And that's why I'm very proud that the United States is the biggest supplier of food aid in the world. And I appreciate this hearing that will draw attention to ways that we can improve and streamline the food aid process and make it even more effective and impactful. I just want to take 1 minute to recognize the work of a wonderful nonprofit based in my district in Rhode Island that does so much work in this area of food aid and global nutrition. Dr. Shaw was Raising Plumpy Nut, which is produced by Adesia Global Nutritional Solutions, a really innovative and targeted approach to ensuring that populations around the world have access to healthy nutritional food by producing ready-to-use therapeutic and supplementary foods through large humanitarian organizations such as UNICEF, the World Food Program, and USAID. This organization has demonstrated incredible leadership in tackling the issue of international food aid, and I applaud them, and particularly their founder, Navin Salem, for their extraordinary work. And Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the statement of Adesia, which is based in the 1st Congressional District of Rhode Island, and I'll pass that along.
Without objection.
Thank you. I want to thank the witnesses for your extraordinary work in this area and for your testimony, and ask, I just really have 3 questions and open up first for Dr. Shaw. I know that in response to the Syrian humanitarian crisis, the Emergency Food Security Program has allowed the use of cash resources, and I wonder if you could speak a little about the experience in Syria and why that's been important, and what the benefits are in responding to emergencies like Syria. One of the questions that some of the opponents of these reforms have raised, as my colleague Congresswoman Bass has mentioned, is about the nutritional value. How do we ensure that the food is meeting certain nutritional standards, and maybe what we can do to ensure that that happens? And then finally, the most important question for me is, as you listen to the testimony and you study this issue, it seems really obvious that these reforms are necessary to make our aid work more effectively and to reach more people who are in need of this nutrition and food. And it seems as if, according to the testimony today, it's supported by the maritime industry. It's really supported by most farmers. You know, why hasn't it happened? What do you see as the obstacles, and what can we do to overcome those obstacles? Because it makes so much sense to me. And I know Mr. Glickman will have some insight on that as well.
Some of this is just historical. As I pointed out before, we've grown up with the physical observation of giving things overseas, and it's been part of our culture. And I think that it was based on as I said, the nature of agriculture. Although I think the farm community always had a strong humanitarian core to it, in addition to the need to relieve themselves of the surpluses that they've had. But I do think that more education is needed on this, because the facts are really clear. We need more flexibility. It doesn't have to be 100%, but we need to move like what you've done already, from 25 to 50%, or whatever the number that you would come up with is. And I think we would save a lot of lives. Second of all, nutrition. As Dr. Shaw's organization has done so much in this, raw commodities are not necessarily nutritional salvation. We're learning a lot more about nutrition and vitamin content, nutrients, to not only to build lives, but to prevent disease, particularly non-communicable diseases. And so we're going to have a lot of technology in the future with private sector groups like the ones in your district and others to amplify what we're already sending. And most of that's not going to be in bags of food. But I just think we need more and better education. Talking about these issues.
I just want to build on Dan's point, because I think within the traditional 3 stakeholder groups, agriculture, shipping, and NGO, there is mainstream support for reform in each of those groups. There's been a history of categorizing those groups together, though, and saying the shippers think X or the NGOs think Y. And the reality is, in each of those categories, there are 1 or 2 parts of the stakeholder community that would rather not see reform and are promulgating the concept that the program will somehow fall apart if its focus shifts from essentially requirements on behalf of agricultural and shipping interests to results and evidence on behalf of what saves the most lives most efficiently. And the only response to that, I'd say, is if you look at every other country in the world that has made this shift over the last 50 years, their level of commitment has not gone down, it has gone up. And even in tough environments, even in just the last decade, countries like the United Kingdom have managed under a conservative government to significantly increase their investments in these kinds of activities, motivated more by the idea that they're getting efficiency and results and outcomes than by the idea that they are somehow protecting or taking care of a domestic stakeholder group and constituency. Because as Dan points out, mathematically, the program no longer really meaningfully supports those constituencies on a financial basis. So that hopefully is helpful.
Thank you. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
May I ask, I think there is real concern that food aid programs been sustained by a particular set of partly self-interested actors for all these decades. And so if you take the self-interest out of it, that maybe the funding for food aid will drop. So in fact, I think, say, for rice growers, the real self-interest stake at this point is that between 1990 and today, the number of people in extreme poverty has dropped in half. And those people are now eating, and a lot of those people are eating rice, you know, so somehow within the ag community especially, we need to make the shift to help the real stake, the real self-interest stake of U.S. agriculture is that people get out of hunger and be able to buy food, and then not just raw commodities, but also ideas and knowledge about how to do it right. And then I think what's important about that is not only funding for food aid, it's funding for all of everything we do to help reduce poverty around the world. You know, there's just deep cynicism still among the American people. People don't know that the world has made progress against poverty. I think only 10% of American voters know that. And then, you know, if you ask a typical voter how much of our aid, our foreign aid, really gets to the people it's supposed to get to, you know, something like 10% think that, oh yeah, it really gets to the people who need it. They support it anyway. So it's really crucial that you reform food aid, partly because of that broader constituency, because this is really a scandal, and it's got to be fixed, or it undercuts support not just for food aid, but for everything that our country's doing to support progress against hunger and poverty around the world.
Thank you, Reverend. The chair also thanks the representative from Rhode Island. The chair now turns to himself for some questions. Dr. Barrett, in determining fair and reasonable rates, MARAD allows for a 19% profit margin for U.S. ships moving food aid, but only a 9% margin for ships moving DoD cargoes. Given the humanitarian mandate of food for peace, does this seem fair and reasonable? Just if you can talk us through that.
I run an undergraduate business school, the Dyson School at Cornell. If I offered my students the opportunity to make a guaranteed 19% return on all their activities, I don't think we need to teach them a whole lot. Just let them sign up and take the option. That's an extraordinarily high guaranteed rate of return, because keep in mind, this is a reimbursement plus margin contract that's on offer. And the fact that it's a higher rate of return guaranteed on humanitarian shipments than it is on military shipments, it begs the question of why would we offer a 10% profit premium because you're helping out people who are starving? It sort of defies logic, and it's clearly an anti-competitive practice. Again, I run a business school. I'm a big believer in the virtue of competition in private enterprise. And what we really need to see is that these shipping lines that are able to provide very cost-effective freight delivery services over long distances, the mariners who do these activities are very brave souls. Tragically, we just saw a vessel lost during Hurricane Joaquin. You know, these are not jobs to be taken lightly. These are not tasks that are unimportant. But the question is, why are we guaranteeing an extraordinarily high profit margin when this is a highly competitive industry? Let the vessels compete, and let's let the commercial producers who now also need those same ocean freight services get access to the same vessels without having to see them diverted from time to time because there are these windfall profit opportunities associated with the MARAD rules on markup.
So in keeping with that, a study by AEI has found that U.S. shipping companies are charging higher rates for U.S. food aid cargoes than other commercial cargoes carried on the very same vessels. Any idea how this cost discrepancy can be accounted for?
The economics of it are rather simple, sir. When you don't have competition, the provider can mark up the price. Commercial cargoes are highly competitive. It's a very competitive market out there. That's one reason why the
So there's nothing special with carrying food that would
No.
would justify the increased cost for the sake of itself.
No, it's
In your
you're-
opinion.
You're carrying the same vessels are carrying agricultural commodities commercially, and they're just charging less when they're carrying them commercially because the market won't sustain the inflated price associated with cargo preference. The protections drive up the price. It's monopoly pricing.
Okay, Dr. Shah, Farm Bill, the 2014 Farm Bill provided some cash flexibility, and you also have the Emergency Food Security Fund. Can you explain why you're pressing for more flexibility? Has not enough been provided at this point?
No, not enough has been provided. And if you look at what the Farm Bill did, and I was very, very grateful for the progress made in the Farm Bill, it took the part of the food aid account that goes to administration, but also to results monitoring and measurement data and analytics, and took that from 13% to 20%, and then made that more flexible such that that could be used for the kinds of things we're talking about on this panel: cash transfers, vouchers, medical foods, et cetera. So in practice, it was a 7% on the total volume of additional flexibility, which is a big gain, but it's 7%. I mean, it should be 50% or 60% or something like that if we're going to be serious about reform.
So just to codify the argument is a move in the right direction, but just way too small from the perspective of what absolutely needs to be done and what actually needs to be done.
Exactly.
Okay. Thank you. Chair now turns to the representative from California, Mr. Barra.
Thank you, Chairman.
Dr. Barra.
Yeah, it's good to see Dr. Shaw back in here, Secretary Glickman, and all the witnesses. Obviously, an incredibly important topic as we reflect our values as Americans, wanting to relieve suffering around the world. Would it be accurate to say the goal of this program and Food for Peace primarily is to relieve that suffering, relieve suffering from hunger, starvation, food insecurity? Is that an accurate assessment? That should be our driving goal. So in that context, when we look at using the taxpayers' resources, we should evaluate that in the context of how do we best use those resources to achieve that goal. Is that fair? So in that context, Dr. Barrett, I think you suggested that we're spending, for every dollar we're spending, about 35 to 40 cents goes to achieve that goal, compared to comparative economies like Canada, where it's 70 cents per goal. So we're not doing a very good job in using our resources to achieve what the driving goal is. Is it accurate that potentially a secondary goal is, within U.S. industries, within the agricultural sector, within the maritime sector, to help stabilize those industries? Was that a secondary goal in the original design, or was that just, I guess, Secretary Glickman?
The one secondary goal in the agriculture sector was relieve the U.S. from massive surpluses, which kept prices low. I can't speak as much to the maritime, but my guess is that there were similar pressures there as well a long time ago.
But again, that may have been a secondary goal in the original design of the program back in the 1950s. I guess, Secretary Glickman, if we allowed some flexibility in the program today to change from just shipping commodities to perhaps purchasing product in country or shipping higher nutritional commodities, how would that affect the agricultural sector today?
In terms of net income on reduced, let's say, in-kind shipments, it would be negligible. It would be virtually insignificant. Now, there are a few things that we've seen some increase in in-kind assistance. I think grain sorghum, we've seen some increase on the purchase for humanitarian assistance. And I mentioned these pulse crops, which are largely lentils. They're still very, very small. But in terms of the major U.S. commodities, wheat, corn, soybeans, it would have virtually no impact at all.
Minimal impact. And Dr. Barrett, on maritime security, on maritime employment, would it have much impact?
Zero. And let me also just echo in the agricultural sector, growth in small specialty crop sales into the food aid system is being driven largely by needs assessments in countries that are calling for commodities that are more suited to that particular population that naturally eat sorghum, et cetera. The income effects on American growers are zero. Same effects for maritime employment, sir.
Okay, so in that context, the secondary goal really, again, we should be making our decisions as members of Congress, and I think the taxpayers would expect us to make those decisions for that primary goal of relieving suffering, using our resources in the most efficient way to relieve suffering around the world. Even if there was a secondary goal of U.S. employment, Dr. Shah, I think in your earlier answers, suggested there would be a better way to use resources and manufacture products. Some of these highly nutritional products that can help relieve suffering in a more efficient way. Is that accurate?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. In fact, we did a study when I was at USAID with Tufts University that demonstrated the nutritional frontier here. And there's plenty of room for new products that are both peanut-based, rice-based, U.S. commodity-based, but nutritionally enhanced, pre-prepared. And as I've noted, 10 years from now, it should all be, the program should be advanced manufactured foods, and we've seen a track record of creating U.S. jobs here as a result of that opportunity.
Fabulous. And I would imagine there's a secondary, because if we're shipping direct commodities, I imagine there's some cost to loss of food for spoilage and certainly the cost of storage as well, in country as well as the shipping costs, that products like these highly nutritious products are probably easier to ship and certainly easier to store, and spoilage is less of a factor. That's probably pretty accurate. Just in my short time left, I think, Dr. Barrett, you quoted a number, $125 per child year saved. If you could just expand on that. So.
Sure. That figure, that estimate comes out of a recent study published in the journal Lancet, a leading global public health journal, where a collection of leading scholars looked at the cost effectiveness of different interventions for public health. And child acute malnutrition is commonly identified as the single most cost-effective intervention we can make in the world. The Copenhagen Consensus, for example, in assessing a wide range of prospective global interventions, identified addressing child nutrition, in particular severe acute malnutrition, as the highest benefit cost ratio investment available to the global community. So it's at $125 per child life year saved. That's the cost per child life year saved. So for a newborn with a 70-year life expectancy, multiplied by 70, we're talking something like $8,000 for a child to live a full, healthy life.
Mr. Chairman, if you would indulge me, Dr. Shah, within that $125, would it be more efficient for us to spend those resources on these highly nutritious products?
Absolutely, absolutely. In fact, it's important to recognize that the sort of bulk grain feeding approach was never designed as a targeted solution for child malnutrition. It was designed for exactly what it was, getting rid of American commodities, and in places that were commodity scarce, having some food, because it seems logical that food helps save lives during a famine.
I just want to make a point, a little boost for agriculture. A lot of these programs grew in recent years in large part because of bipartisan support of two farm state senators, Bob Dole and George McGovern. And they were, I'm sure there was some foundation for the getting rid of surpluses, but most of this is because of the nutritional efforts of the program. And so I don't want people to think that agriculture is just interested in moving commodities. It's got a long history on the humanitarian side as well.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair thanks the gentleman. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly.
Thank you, and welcome to our panelists. My first job here in Washington was to be the executive director of the American Freedom from Hunger Foundation. And I spent 10 years doing that before I went to graduate school. And during that time, Reverend Beckman, by the way, worked with Art Simon in the founding of Bread for the World. I didn't found it, he did. but I provided some counsel and assistance in how to set up that nonprofit. I also worked with Paul Simon. When he was Lieutenant Governor of Illinois, I wrote the introduction to one of his books on the politics of hunger. So this topic's near and dear to me. Candidly, Dr. Shah, what you just said about the founding of the program and the purpose of the commodities, I think is at variance with what Secretary Glickman just said. And I'm old enough to remember George McGovern and Bob Dole, and most certainly there was a nutritional aspect to the program. I am old. I think we're being a little facile in just dismissing the commodities aspect of this program, and I think we're being more than a little facile, with all due respect, to the politics up here of continued support for these kinds of interventions and efforts. Can one really imagine a Bob Dole and a George McGovern coming together in this Congress to support the new food aid program? Really?
I would do it. I can't tell
Who
you
would
what
do it?
influence I think Bob Dole and George McGovern.
They're not here anymore.
No, I know, but
I'm talking about this Congress. Can we imagine a Bob Dole, a George McGovern coming together and saying, yeah, let's fund this. Let's decommoditize it and fund it because it's the right thing to do. I am skeptical. I am concerned. I helped write the last foreign aid authorization bill passed by a Congress. That was in 1986, Dr. Shah. We have not passed a foreign aid authorization bill since 1986. There's a reason. It certainly isn't the popularity of foreign aid. And so I'm just concerned. I don't have a dog in the fight. I don't represent an agricultural area. The last dairy farm in Fairfax County is Frying Pan Park, where we take kids to see what a cow looks like. We used to be the largest dairy producing county in Virginia. So, you know, I don't have shipping interests. I don't have agricultural interests. I am actually concerned about trying to make sure we're the most efficient and we're helping the largest number of people. Reverend Beckman, you pointed out about the fact that you know, we actually have some success stories in lifting people out of poverty. And I agree with you, although I would suggest that the largest single example, certainly in my lifetime and in human history, is in China. And it's not because of foreign aid. It's because of policy reform that lifted the largest single number of people out of poverty in the history of humanity and in the briefest, most condensed time frame, which is a sobering thought. It wasn't because of foreign aid or AID or any of the UN agencies. Not that they're irrelevant, but that's not what happened in China. And yeah, they now have purchasing power. You know, I remember in the 50s, there was a famine in China. No one would think about a famine in China today. That's how much the world has changed in a relatively brief period of time. So at any rate, you're welcome to comment. I'd start with Secretary Glickman because you come from up here. You were part of those wars. You were Secretary of Agriculture. Just how easy will it be, do you think, to put together a coalition that will readily support this kind of intervention long term in terms of appropriating dollars?
Not easy, but not impossible. You all did it in the last Farm Bill. You made changes. You made the programs more flexible. There was opposition. You negotiated the percentages and what you were going to be doing. These are not the kinds of changes that have to gridlock a Congress, to be honest with you. And right and left, there is such a history of bipartisanship in feeding the hungry and dealing with the problems of poor and poverty around the world, as you know, that I think that you can do it. I also don't think it takes huge amounts of additional funding. We don't have that. We know that. So I don't think you're talking about an impossible task, to be honest with you. And I think your history shows there's reason to believe that you can work together on this. The other thing I would tell you is Dr. Shah, I'm just going to stroke him for a moment. He's out of this job.
Yeah, if I may interrupt, don't make a straw man. No one talked about it being an impossible task.
Yeah.
What I said was, I think we're being a little too facile about the struggle we will face in this Congress.
Yeah, well, straw's an agricultural commodity, so I can say that as well. And I think the fact that you showed that you can make some progress before, just in the last few years, means you can make more progress. And also, the nature of the conflicts now, they dwarf the conflicts of the last 20 or 30 years. Not the Second World War necessarily, but they're just everywhere. The levels are higher, the problems are much greater. So I think I think you got a chance here to really do something good. That would be my, I didn't get a chance to stroke in.
From your lips to God's ears.
Representative,
Dr.
if I could,
Shah.
yeah, just to add a few thoughts. First is I would in no way contradict Dan. I agree with not only everything he said, my comment about the nutritional focus, there's no question the agricultural community has supported these programs with a desire to have significant nutritional impact. I've been with committee members from the agricultural committees as we've traveled in settings, and the passion is extraordinary, and it's about saving those children's lives. The point I wanted to make was that the science about how to do that has evolved such that actually there's more, we know so much more today about how to save those lives effectively and efficiently, and it is different from the strategies we used to deploy even 10, 15 years ago, and that's all I meant to imply by that. The second thing I'd say on the politics is, you know, I had this experience with, as I learned and met many of the leaders in the shipping community and the agricultural community, but the shipping community in particular, I just believe there's been a mismatch of understanding that this program is not going to be able to sustain itself as a major source of revenue for shippers over the course of the next decade because of natural transitions in what's happening in the program. The volume of food is coming down. The replacement of grains with more targeted foods that are just denser and lighter in aggregate and cheaper to ship in aggregate. And so the structure of the program is already changing, and that is already impacting these constituencies. So I do think the time is now to have an open and partnership-oriented discussion. We had structured, maybe about a year ago, some compromise ideas that landed in a place where there was significant additional flexibility, 2 to 3 million more people reached and lives saved, a role for shippers, but not in the current context, not the same as today's deal, and a focus on bringing some agricultural partners into this more advanced food picture by creating, you know, rice and legume-based products as opposed to just peanut-based products, you know, that are more targeted and more effective. So there's a way to design the future that builds on the politics of the past, and I believe there's an opportunity to do it now.
Well, I didn't know about your help in starting Bread for the World, so thank you for that.
No,
appreciate it.
I just provided advice.
No, I appreciate it. I just, that I'm encouraged, actually, by the degree of bipartisanship that we've seen on international aid issues. You know, you're in the fray, so you may not feel it, but it's really extraordinary that during the Bush administration, the Obama administration, that we've had real improvements and expansion of the programs that are focused on poverty, hunger, and disease. And it's been done in a bipartisan way with some authorizing legislation and then steady and pretty rapid increases in appropriations for the programs that are focused on poverty, hunger, and disease. And those increases have continued since 2011. And I think it's partly because that our aid programs have worked. You know, people have seen that PEPFAR has dramatically improved the situation in relationship to the global AIDS pandemic. And people can see that half of Africa is doing remarkably well. And that some of that is because of policy reform, but it was also supported by the Millennium Challenge Corporation and IDA and other things that have been supported by this committee. So I think in a certain way, you know, we're in a really encouraging situation, and getting the reform of food aid done is really important to sustaining American confidence in all of these efforts to participate in what the world is doing to reduce poverty, hunger, and disease. You know, when I talk to church groups across the country, and I was in Wichita yesterday, there are a lot of Republicans in Wichita. I talk about food aid reform in Wichita. I start on that because everybody's shaking their heads. You know that last year Congress got some additional food aid reform, enough to give food aid to 1.5 million more of the world's poorest people last year at no cost to U.S. taxpayers. Folks in Wichita like that a lot. So I think getting this done is really important to a continued bipartisan collaboration on some of the things that this committee has provided leadership for.
Thank you, Reverend. Mr. Conley, and thank you. Recognizes now Mr. Sherman from California.
Thank you. Begin by pointing out that I've got no farms in my district. I've got no ports in my district. I do have oranges grown in my state, but I'm not sure that oranges are part of our food aid program. I do not have a dog in this fight. I do not have an orange in this fight. But I'm convinced that if we simply abolish the Food for Peace program, and let's face it, turning it into the Money for Peace program means that it is simply a Xerox of several of our other foreign aid programs, that we're going to have less total expenditures on aid in the future. That if you abandon the interests that have been pushing for this program and say, we're not with you, they will not be with us. Mr. Glickman, you know a little something about Congress, a little something about agriculture. Could you imagine the Ag Approps Subcommittee just declaring that their total allotment should be reduced and that money transferred to the Subcommittee on Foreign Operations?
Probably not. But let me just say this. I'm not advocating turning the Food for Peace program into the Money for Peace program, period.
No, I'm not. I just wanted that.
But all we're talking about is flexibility, so you can move money and commodities around a little more.
As to flexibility, the State Department has come into this room on many occasions, and they've shown an incredible hostility, if anything, to American jobs, to the idea that anything purchased in America relates to jobs. They have testified that there is no connection between our trade deficit and employment. And they certainly act that way, and if you wonder whether that's true, just look at the fact we have the largest trade deficit in the history of mammalian life. So giving them flexibility is pretty much the same thing if you give them a lot of flexibility. Do you think that if the State Department is given the authority to turn the Food for Peace program into basically a Money for Peace program, Dr. Shaw, do you think that the shippers, agriculture will continue to support the program?
You know, the bill that passed, or the bill that came very close to passing here, I guess 2 years ago now, called for a 50% commodity, 50% flexibility-oriented approach. That strikes me as about right in terms of the range of both what's politically possible and what would dramatically enhance the quality of outcomes. It would allow you to have commodities used and deployed where they are valued and needed and play a role, and it would allow you to use the flexible resources to do the targeted feeding, life-saving activities, fast and efficient activities. And in that context, I believe the shipping community, together with the agricultural community, together with the NGO community, could support that type of package of flexible plus commodity.
We clearly need some flexibility, and the exact number that would keep the alliance together while providing the most efficient aid. There's another part of our aid. Obviously, we want to feed people, but it's also sold to the American people as a for-peace program, which basically means it's not just for humanitarian reasons. It's to enhance the image of the United States. When we buy food locally, that's less of a statement to the recipients that this food is really from America. What is done to make sure that we have the same, Dr. Shaw, impact on on the recipients and on the press covering it and on the whole world. I mean, we've done nothing as successful in the Islamic world than our aid after typhoons that hit Indonesia and Malaysia. So what can we do with the buying food locally and still have that impact, Dr. Shaw?
Well, I would just point out that in Haiti, in Tacloban, in the Philippines, in Syria today, in Jordan and Lebanon, whenever we use flexible resources, they come in the form of a branded voucher or a branded biometric ID card that a family will hold in their pocket, will tell you is saving their family and their society at a critical time, and is emblazoned with the USAID logo and the phrase "from the American people," usually written in the local language, and they take extraordinary pride in that. So I think we have seen in all of these settings that you can have a flexible assistance program that is cognizant of the importance of projecting America's values, and people react very, very favorably to that.
So some of us are old-fashioned enough to think of flag on the bag. In this century, it's flag on the card. Okay. I yield back.
And just for the record, as I understand it, right, this is the bag we're talking about.
Okay.
Chair thanks the gentleman. The chair now thanks the gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel.
Yeah, I just wanted to, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to ask Reverend Beckman one last question. So the statistics show that we can feed between 2 and 6 million more people in need with simple, common sense reforms. But like everything else, special interests get in the way. People are looking at how it affects some of these interests. So, as the CEO for Bread for the World, how do you build? You touched on it, but I'd like you to expand on it. How do you build public and political will to reform our international food aid system?
I think this is a really good issue to build public and political will for our foreign assistance generally, because, I mean, just within Bread for the World, it's clear to our constituency that we fight just as hard to make these programs effective as we do to get more money. And across the political spectrum, the demonstrated concern about effectiveness and efficiency, and not just trying to get more money for poor people, but protecting taxpayer dollars in that process. I just know that builds support, not only for the food aid program, but for everything that our government is doing to support what the world is doing to reduce poverty and hunger. I thought Mr. Sherman's point about the agriculture support is important. We need to, not necessarily, but all of us, I think, need to be cognizant of the agriculture community's strong support for food aid over many decades. Really, at this point, their self-interest is not the food aid. Their self-interest is reducing hunger. When, in the 1990s, when East Asia had a big improvement, lots of people got out of poverty, that was great for U.S. agriculture. In the same way as Africa comes out, as people come out of hunger and poverty, that means, poor people typically spend 2/3 of their total income on a couple plates of food a day. So some of the increased food that people are able to buy, the more variety, some of that will come from the U.S. and especially like breeder stock and technology behind the expanded production of food. So U.S. agriculture has a real and enduring self-interest reason for being in alliance with hungry people around the world. And it's really important that as we make this transition that we maintain that. So in practical terms, it's going to mean compromises and doing this step by step probably. I don't know about the shippers. I'm not sure we can keep them with us. But agriculture, They have a real stake in this. And then on top of it, most of the farmers and people in farm states I know, they're conservative, church-going people. If you tell them that this is a way to save money on a government program and then reach more of the world's most desperate people with food, they're for it.
If I may, Congressman Engel, there may be a lesson to be learned in the Canadian experience of reforming their food aid programs 10 years ago. Canada, like the United States, ran a surplus disposal program. Like the United States, they had price support programs that absorbed surpluses generated by Canadian farmers and shipped them overseas as food aid. And then the Indian Ocean tsunami hit right after Christmas in 2004. And the Canadian law prescribed that Canada could only send up to 10% of its food aid through cash-based assistance. 90% of the budget had to be commodities procured in Canada. The Indian Ocean tsunami hit rice-eating communities. There's not a lot of rice grown in Canada. So the Canadian farm community, note the farm community, led by the Canadian Food Grains Bank, was so embarrassed by the Canadian food aid program's restrictions that the Canadians could not respond to populations in desperate need of food because they ran out of their budget in the first 2 weeks. That immediately, within the year, the Canadian Parliament changed Canadian food aid law. It went from 90% buy Canada, ship from Canada, to 50% within the year. We shouldn't have to wait for the same sort of tragic event. The farm community cares about food. It cares about people eating a nutritious diet. And these restrictions inhibit our ability as the world's most productive agricultural economy to advance that shared goal. This should be doable.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Chair thanks the gentleman. We also thank the witnesses for their time and insightful testimony. It's clear that in a time of unprecedented need, we need to do whatever we can to make our food aid programs as efficient and as effective as possible. You have all clearly laid out the challenges and opportunities lying ahead of us, and we thank you for that. With that, this hearing is adjourned.
No worries.
I'll see you in Guatemala.
Right here.